Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking the absolutely fascinating, totally contradictory legacy of America's 29th president, Warren G. Harding. When we think of presidential history, certain names are practically etched in gold, right? Washington, Lincoln, Roosevelt. But then, there are those at the exact opposite end of the spectrum. Names forever linked with scandal, shame, and, well, historical failure. And that brings us to Harding. He's widely remembered for presiding over literally one of the most corrupt administrations in U.S. history. But the story of this easygoing, business-friendly Ohioan, it's full of paradoxes that make his time in office way more complex than just a simple tale of sleaze. Just think about this number for a second. 9 million. That is the staggering, estimated number of mourning Americans who lined the train route to pay their respects as Harding's body was returned to Washington after he died suddenly in 1923. It's huge. His death hit the nation like an absolute shockwave. You see, at the time of his passing, barely halfway through his first term, by the way, Harding was incredibly popular. People genuinely loved the guy, and this massive outpouring of grief was an astonishing display of a nation mourning a leader they felt was cruelly snatched away before his time. So, this brings us to the ultimate mystery we're going to solve today. How on earth did a man who died as a beloved icon so quickly see his legacy devolve into a historical punchline of sleaze and corruption? Literally almost immediately after his death, these shocking stories began to leak out about his administration. The public whiplash was severe, and Harding's reputation went from universally admired to rock bottom almost overnight. So what exactly happened? To understand this whiplash, we actually have to look back at his 1920 electoral victory. Harding completely crushed his opponents. He secured a massive 60% of the popular vote, which was the biggest landslide since 1820. Following the exhausting, government-expanding, progressive era of Woodrow Wilson, Americans were just tired, and Harding capitalized on this perfectly. He offered this vague, kind of undefined promise of a return to normalcy. The public didn't want grand visions anymore. They wanted comforting cliches, and Harding delivered that on a silver platter, carrying huge Republican majorities into both chambers of Congress. But here's where the tragic irony of Harding really shines through, best captured by his own private confession. Immediately upon taking power, with all that unprecedented support, he admitted, "I am not fit for this office and should never have been here." Most presidents enter the Oval Office with, immense confidence and visionary agendas. Harding? He walked in with plans to spend his time golfing, fishing, and playing poker. He knew, honestly probably better than anyone else, that he completely lacked the energy and the intellect required to govern the country. Which brings us to part one, the accidental politician, a genial man promoted beyond his abilities. You see, the crucial point here is that Harding never actually wanted to rule. He was fundamentally an accidental politician pushed far beyond his actual abilities. Born in rural Ohio, he grew up to be incredibly handsome and really well-liked. Actually, he was pushed into politics mostly by his ambitious, wealthy wife Florence, and a circle of friends who realized that, frankly, the guy just looked like a president. He was tall, dressed incredibly well, and had this booming voice and demeanor that voters just naturally trusted. But as we know, looking the part just isn't enough. His fatal character flaw is perfectly summed up by a rather blunt observation from his own father, who famously told him, "If you were a girl, Warren, you'd be in the family way all the time. You can't say no." Harding's entire guiding philosophy in life was simply to make everyone happy. He desperately wanted to be liked, and that meant he was easily swayed and totally incapable of setting boundaries, a trait that, as we'll see, would eventually cause his entire administration to implode. This extreme aversion to conflict practically forged his entire political rise. First, he and some friends scraped together $300 to buy a struggling newspaper, the Marion Star, and he ran it by literally never writing a bad story about anyone and famously never firing a single employee. This extreme geniality helped him drift upward into the Ohio Senate and later the U.S. Senate. By 1920, the Republican convention was deadlocked, so party bosses retreated to a smoky back room at the Blackstone Hotel in Chicago, and they realized Harding was the ultimate compromise candidate for one simple reason: he had never made a single political enemy. Now for part two, skeletons in the closet, affairs, hush money, and blackmail. Behind that handsome facade and the friendly handshakes, Harding's inability to say no definitely extended to his personal life. It led to a rampant string of reckless infidelities that almost derailed his career before it even truly got off the ground. His private life was essentially a ticking time bomb of scandal, and he spent massive amounts of energy, and money trying to contain it. Take a look at this number. $300,000. That's the estimated equivalent cost in today's money to silence his 15-year affair with a woman named Carrie Phillips. And this wasn't just your run-of-the-mill affair. Phillips was a highly vocal pro-German sympathizer right during World War I. So after the U.S. declared war on Germany, their relationship went from politically damaging to absolutely toxic. When she threatened to expose him, it kicked off this desperate, frantic scramble to keep her quiet. The sheer lengths Harding went to cover up these toxic affairs were just extraordinarily reckless. I mean, to silence Carrie Phillips, the Republican National Committee actually helped bankroll a $20,000 bonus and an all-expenses-paid trip to Japan for her. But it wasn't just Phillips. In 1919, a much younger woman named Nan Britton gave birth to Harding's secret love child. So he paid regular monthly hush money to keep that quiet, too. Astoundingly, once he became president, he risked the whole shebang by sneaking Britton into a coat closet right next to the Oval Office for secret rendezvous. Absolutely wild. Which brings us to a really interesting pivot in Part 3, the surprising good, Harding's unexpected progressive victories. Hearing all that scandalous stuff, it is so easy to just dismiss Harding entirely, right? But here's the thing. Despite his deep character flaws, his limited talents, and his wildly scandalous personal life, Harding actually pulled off some remarkably progressive feats during his short time in office. And this is exactly where the real paradox of his presidency comes into focus. Surprisingly enough, Harding possessed a genuinely empathetic side. That desperate desire of his to make everyone happy, it actually translated into real, tangible support for the vulnerable. For example, in 1921, he gave a blistering speech advocating for economic equality to a racially segregated audience in Alabama, a hugely unusual and brave move for that era. He spent valuable political capital trying to make lynching a federal crime. He successfully pushed the powerful steel industry to adopt an 8-hour workday, and he funded healthcare clinics that dropped the infant mortality rate by a massive 9%. Honestly, had he just possessed a bit more energy and backbone, he might be remembered today as a true champion of America's underdogs. But then we get to Part 4, the Ohio gang, sleaze, plunder, and betrayal. Unfortunately for Harding, whatever progressive victories he managed to achieve were utterly eclipsed by the actions of a group that came to be known as the Ohio gang. Because Harding was well aware of his own limitations, he delegated heavily. And while he did put some highly competent people in charge of certain departments, he also handed enormous unchecked power to the incredibly sleazy group of friends he brought with him from Ohio. His administration became this catastrophic duality. It's like a split personality. On one hand, you've got a president commuting sentences, balancing budgets, and building healthcare clinics for mothers. Great stuff. But on the other hand, his appointed friends were basically running the federal government like a criminal mob. We're talking active bribery, extortion, racketeering, and, get this, even selling confiscated medicinal alcohol to bootleggers right in the middle of Prohibition. Now, Harding was definitely aware of the rampant theft happening right under his nose, but he valued their companionship far too much to stop them. He just didn't want to cause conflict with his buddies. He once famously lamented, "I have no trouble with my enemies, but my damn friends, they're the ones who keep me walking the floor nights." It was that fatal inability to say no rearing its ugly head all over again. He simply could not bring himself to rein in the very people who were taking advantage of his goodwill. And that leads us to Part 5. Teapot Dome and ruin, the ultimate scandal. This total lack of accountability set the perfect stage for a public relations disaster of absolute epic proportions. It was a scandal that would completely ruin Harding's legacy forever. In fact, it became the absolute benchmark for presidential misconduct in the United States, right up until Watergate decades later. It all centered around this seemingly boring outcrop of rock in Wyoming called Teapot Dome. It became the epicenter of an unprecedented plundering of public resources. Basically, Harding's Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, convinced the president to transfer control of these emergency Navy oil reserves over to his department. And almost the second Harding signed off on it, Fall started making these secret, highly lucrative backroom agreements with incredibly wealthy private oil barons. The scandal unfolded with devastating speed. In 1921, the transfer happens. Fast forward to 1922, and the Wall Street Journal breaks the news that something highly corrupt is going on, sparking official investigations. By the summer of 1923, the walls were rapidly closing in on the administration. Harding embarks on this big Western tour to Alaska, and he is clearly stressed and burdened by the impending exposure of all these scandals. On his way back, he suddenly falls ill and dies of a suspected heart attack at just 57 years old. He basically left his legacy entirely defenseless against the incoming shockwave of these investigations. The ensuing fallout exposed the truly staggering depths of the Ohio gang's greed, completely annihilating any shred of goodwill Harding had left. I mean, Albert Fall was taking hundreds of thousands of dollars in bribes, quite literally delivered to him in little black bags. This resulted in him becoming the very first former cabinet secretary ever jailed for crimes committed in office. Other friends, like Veterans Bureau Director Charles Forbes, were convicted of defrauding the exact government they were supposed to be serving. This sweeping criminality permanently secured Harding's position at the very bottom of historical presidential rankings. So, the tragic reality of Harding's paradox is really just this. He wasn't some evil mastermind orchestrating a grand criminal syndicate. He was, at his core, a profoundly mediocre man who was just deeply, deeply out of his depth. He was too eager to please, and he simply could not say no to the wrong people. The immense power of the presidency didn't actually corrupt Warren G. Harding. It just acted as a giant magnifying glass that showed the whole world exactly who he was all along. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder about the true nature of power. Looking at Harding's tragic ascent and his spectacular posthumous fall, we really have to ask ourselves, does the highest office change a leader, or does it merely expose the fatal flaws they possessed all along? It really makes you wonder what it actually takes to endure the intense scrutiny of supreme leadership, and, well, how many leaders even today are promoted far, far beyond their actual talents. Thank you so much for joining me to explore this wildly fascinating piece of history.